for debt. He elaborates on these ideas in his book, Why We Can't Wait, published the year after the March on Washington. Again, citing the nation's history of racial slavery, he explains that enslaved Africans did not own their own bodies, nor did they own their labor. Instead, they were property stolen by others. King quickly reminds his reader that although the slavery of pre-1865 America was gone, the racist institutions and logics that devalued African and African descended people persisted. The rationale that previously justified American slavery caused the most upstanding citizen, the most upstanding white citizen, to ask, what is the Negro willing to pay if we give him his freedom? What is the Negro willing to pay if we give him his freedom? By 1963 and 1964, King was trying to combat the idea that Black people must compensate the United States of America whenever they take a step toward freedom. His opening words to his most famous 1963 speech attempted to invert the logic of Black indebtedness. The logical conclusion of King's attempts to invert the dehumanizing rationale of anti-Blackness was to call for financial reparations. To my knowledge, however, he never did. And that's okay. And that is okay. Because by 1963, people like Queen Mother Audley Moore, who's pictured here, economist and university professor Robert S. Brown, and many others were using similar logic to make a case for compensating the descendants of the enslaved for human trafficking, forced labor, sexual, physical, and psychological abuse, discrimination, segregation, and if we're talking about the North specifically, widespread racist riots up to 1865, and for expanded racist terrorism, more forced and coerced labor, more discrimination, more segregation, and the added refusal to protect Black people's civil and human rights since the adoption of the 13th, 14th, 15th, and later the 19th Amendments. So this person who's pictured here, Mother, as she was called, she agreed with King's logic, and she helped found a revolutionary Black nationalist struggle, the New African Independence Movement, that would work toward similar logic as that expressed by King through a movement that continues to engage in important ways with the broader collectivity of Black left political organizing. And so today I'm going to talk about that movement that Queen Mother Moore helped share. I'll do so by sharing, a couple of snippets from my most recent book project with you. And what I hope to do is after going through some of my arguments and some of the key points that I make, I want to swing back around to this idea of reparations to help us think about and perhaps discuss a little bit later the ongoing struggle that people like Queen Mother Moore helped really get going. And so in my book, Free the Land, I basically argue that the New African Independence Movement activists attached their lifestyles and life decisions to the pursuit of their ambitious political objectives for land and liberation. I do so by using this concept, lifestyle politics. And the thing I like about the term is not only does it help us think about how people shape their lives to match the struggle, but it also helps us think about how over time, as people struggled and as they let their lives kind of adapt to their political goals, they started to help the goals of the overall movement evolve and change and adapt to the changing circumstances. So today I'd like to go through some aspects of that argument with a specific focus on how naming and considerations about family lend themselves to the ongoing development of the movement. So this story begins with Milton and Richard Henry. Milton is on your left, Richard is on your right. These are two brothers from Philadelphia who moved in the mid-1950s to the Detroit metro area. And there they co-founded a number and worked with a number of civil rights groups one being the Group on Advanced Leadership, or GOAL. I like to mention GOAL because in 1963, they helped host a grassroots leadership conference. And at that conference, they invited Malcolm X to give a closing rally speech. And it's there that he gave his famous message to the grassroots speech. In the message to the grassroots speech, Malcolm X talks about what revolution means, and he contrasts what he calls the Negro Revolution with what he considers to be the Black Revolution or real revolution, pulling on examples from the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the American Revolution. He comes to the conclusion that revolutions are two things. One, they're bloody. Second, they're fought over land. When he gave this speech, he had a huge influence on many people in the crowd, including the two brothers, Milton and Richard. But the older brother, Milton, was especially touched. Okay. The reason is because he was a Black elected official in Pontiac, Michigan. He was a part of the Pontiac City Commission. And on that commission, he actually felt powerless. He felt especially powerless when he contrasted his own experiences with those of good friends of his, such as Kwame Nkrumah, with whom he went to Lincoln University, and other people who worked for the Nkrumah government in Ghana. He traveled to Ghana. He actually traveled throughout Africa with Malcolm X, and one of the places that he went was Ghana. And there he saw again his friends from college making decisions that had a direct influence on their people. When he was constantly outvoted, he said, anytime he wanted to make decisions that would have a positive impact on the Black community. So that was a really important moment for the Henry brothers, most importantly, Milton Henry. Another important development actually was the assassination of Malcolm X. And the assassination of Malcolm X actually touched a number of activists during the 1960s. For the Henry brothers, it really pushed them to develop their ideas about what revolutionary nationalism means, what it means to think about land and territory, and it pushed them to make some really important steps. First, the Henry brothers changed their names to Richard, who's in the center, and from Richard to Imari, and from Milton to Gaidi. And you can see Gaidi's back there next to Betty Shabazz. The name changes symbolize their embrace of Malcolm X's charge that Black people focus their revolution not on the least threatening line in King's I Have a Dream speech, the ones about equality and friendship with white Americans, but instead on self-determination, on choosing for themselves where to place their consent of citizenship and whether to build their own independent nation. And they weren't alone. During the final weekend in March 1968, over 500 Black nationalists from all across the country came together in Detroit to determine the destiny of the Black nation in America. On the final day of this Black government convention, several dozen attendees agreed to sign a document declaring to the world that they would struggle for complete independence and statehood of that nation, which they named the Republic of New Africa. They planned to use a UN-monitored plebiscite through which their people could once and for all determine where to place their consent of citizenship. The Obadelis and the people pictured here believed that once given a chance to make an informed decision, most Black people would join them in the building of their own independent nation state. And it's important to point out that this convention and the pursuit of self-determination had wide support amongst Pan-African nationalists. As I said, over 500 from all across the country. And as you can see here, highly revered reparations activist Queen Mother Audley Moore not only attended the convention, she actually was one of the people who got it started. And I say that because for many people who knew her and who were around in the 1960s, she set in motion the independence movement by convincing Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, who, by this time is going by El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, that an independent nation was essential to Black liberation. Her presence lent the founding convention legitimacy. She was that widely respected, right? It lent the convention legitimacy. And she confirmed her willingness to struggle for statehood or to free the land when she became the first signer of the Declaration of Independence on March 31st, 1968. As you can see here, Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's wife and then widow, also participated in the convention that the Obadeli brothers called. Like Queen Mother Moore, her presence lent the gathering legitimacy, but also helped garner significant support. And so, although Moore, the Obadeli brothers, and a few others developed the ideas that we call New African Political Science that helped start the movement, it was Imari Obadeli who would, by the early 1970s, become the movement's chief theorist. He published books and pamphlets. He wrote journal articles that were published in places like the Black Scholar. And through these, he attempted to explain the movement's ideas as he labored beside cadre who attempted to, once again, free the land. And it's in there. I should pull up my pointer so I can point this out whenever I say it. Free the land is everywhere, okay? And so with him, though, he decided to begin to work on this New African independence movement in the areas in and around Jackson, Mississippi. And before I move on, I just want to quickly say, here are some of the key terms that I use throughout my book, and that as you become familiar with this social movement, you start to hear and see quite a bit. And so I just wanted to make sure that if I say something like RNA or NAPS, then I'm actually referring to New African Political Science or the Republic of New Africa. And it's also important just to point out real quick, the Republic of New Africa is those 5 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. It's also the captive Black nation, the people who are trying to free those states so that they can govern themselves. So I mentioned that they signed a document. It actually was what they call the RNA Declaration of Independence. And there's some key wording here that I think is important to point out. And I'll just read. So they write, quote, "Ours is a revolution against oppression, our own oppression, and that of all people in the world. Ended is a revolution for a better life," end quote. And I think it's important to point that out because they understood the moment that they were in. We're talking about 1968. The continent of Africa is decolonizing. Asia, decolonizing. In South America, people are fighting for self-determination, and also in parts of the Caribbean. And so they saw theirs as just one struggle within a global revolution against white supremacy and capitalist imperialism. And they saw, if we bring it back to the United States of America, they also saw a number of different, what they would call nations struggling similar to them. A number of these nations being from the indigenous populations who they saw as having superordinate claims to the land over their own. And so I just wanted to mention that real quick. Perhaps it's something we could talk about more during the Q&A. There is a relationship here between the New African Independence Movement and the American Indian Movement that I love to talk about, and hopefully you all want to talk a little bit about. Another thing that is worth mentioning is, like in the Declaration of Independence, as you can see here, they also have an oath. And I'll just read the point that is bolded here. They say that basically in order to bring their ideals into fruition, that the individuals involved have to give their total devotion, my total resources, and the total power of my mortal life. And I mention this all because, again, it helps us think about how people were thinking about shaping their daily activities, their lives, and their lifestyles toward the movement. They saw it as not something that you just do after work or on the weekends, but something that you have to give your total being toward if you want it to be successful. And so now we can look at a couple of ways that they tried to do this in their lives. One way is through, well, 2 ways are through naming and child rearing. And if we think about names, at the beginning, I did a very short libation. Some of the names that I mentioned carried religious significance. Others were based on cultural affinities. All of them sought to empower the people who were looking for strength to struggle for those ideals. And one of them is Chokwe Lumumba, who is pictured here with his first wife, Anasa. Another who I'll talk about in just a moment is Marilyn Preston Killingham. So Chokwe Lumumba, he took those names in 1969 when he was beginning to live out his desires to be a new African revolutionary. The names connected him politically to a person, in this case, Patrice Lumumba, and to a group that he respected, in that case, the Chokwe, an ethnic group from Southwest Africa that he respected, and both served as models for his own life and his political ambitions. If you don't know who Patrice Lumumba was, he was the first elected prime minister of an independent Democratic Republic of Congo. He was assassinated very quickly after he got into that position. He was assassinated with the help of the CIA because they saw him as a communist, and communists are just bad. The Chokwe, one of the things he respected about them was that they were known for their art. They were also known to be skilled elephant hunters, and he was attracted to them for those and a few other reasons. It's important to mention that Chokwe Lumumba held a number of positions within the PGRNA, again, that's the provisional government. Among other things, he was the acting president of the PGRNA when the elected president, Mario Badeli, was imprisoned and therefore unavailable. That's a whole thing that we could talk about for days. Why was he in prison? Lumumba co-founded the New African People's Organization in 1984, and NAPO, as they say, sees itself as a sister organization to the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. NAPO in 1990 created the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement in 1990. And I mentioned them because if any of you are familiar with the most recent Black August hip hop concert, there was one just this past year. It was the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement who put that on, and they've been doing that since the 1990s. Lumumba also co-founded the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America in 1989. I will come back to that in just a moment. Going back to NAPO and MXGM, those organizations convinced him to run for political office in Jackson, Mississippi, and he eventually ran for and was elected as mayor. He died a couple of months after he took the office, and now his son, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, holds that position, and his daughter, Rukia Lumumba, is one of his closest aides. So what we can see here is that these names invested Chokwe Lumumba with a certain type of strength to pledge his total devotion and many of the resources that he had over the years, over the course of his life, to the pursuit of New African independence. And it's something that I think is important to think about because we often, I don't know, I shouldn't assume, but sometimes people don't think too deeply about names. People like Chokwe Lumumba did, and he was very intentional about the names he took on. And he told me when I was able to interview him that they actually did give him strength to do the things that he did over time. Someone else who told me that was Mama Marilyn Preston Killingham, and her name, like Lumumba's, also signified the strength of important ancestors, though in this case, specifically her mother. And the way that she tells the story is her mother's name was Mary, and her mother passed that name on to her, but wanted to change it just a little bit. She replaced the Y with an I and added Lynn. At a time when others in this movement and just across Black America were questioning their so-called slave names, Killingham kept hers because for her, it connected her with a very important African warrior. The name also held great spiritual significance for her. Killingham was a devout Christian who believed that Jesus was a black revolutionary and said, like, hey, his mother's name was Mary, so why would I be ashamed of that? Why would I try to switch that out with something else? Because she held on to her so-called slave name, she and others who made the same decision complicate what it means to separate from an oppressive culture when important people, even though captive, were known to work within that culture to secure a better life. That her mother was an African warrior is also very important here because it helps us better understand how New African women pushed the boundaries of who could even be counted as a warrior, traditionally masculine space, right? And so throughout the 60s and 70s, right? If we just go through a name of a roster of African names, you'll see Sundiata, you'll see Balagoon, Shaka, Simba, all these warrior names. Marilyn Preston Killingham said, my mother was African warrior. I have her name. That is also a strong warrior name. And she wasn't alone. You could also see names such as Asantewaa, Nefertiti, Nzinga, and a whole host of other women's names that were also understood to imbue strength and give a sense of power to the people who held on to those names. And so although Killingham and Lumumba did not agree whether to take on personal names that represented the positionality and identity from which they based their activism, one thing they did agree on was that they were a new African people, right? A new African people. And I mention this because this is a group title that people took on collectively, and it indicated that even though they're of African descent, due to the unique conditions and realities of their ancestors in America, they had become distinct from various other African peoples and nations on the continent. And so if we look at this image right here, I chose this for a couple of reasons. One, because there was an understanding, and actually continues to be in a lot of nationalist circles, that in order to have a strong nation, you need to have a strong family. And I think that this image is particularly striking because you have a New African family standing in front of a bird coming out of some flames. So it's a phoenix who's rising from the ashes of destruction in order to create something new. That's what a lot of New African activists consider themselves to be doing. And so I want to talk about family, but I want to focus specifically on how New Africans thought about raising children. And let's begin with this phrase that's in the top left corner of this image: educate to liberate, okay? Which signify for many African parents the importance of socializing children within the home and placing them, whenever possible, in African-centered schools. There, children and youth would learn to cultivate a sense of self-worth. That the picture's artist gave this child, and I'd like to call her Noni. Noni is a relatively popular Swahili name that means gift of God, and I just like to give names as much as possible. That the artist gave Noni a Black history book is really important. Through reading about and learning her history, Noni could better understand the value of being of African descent, something that even during the era of African independence was still not universally accepted. The history would teach revolutionary and humane values that the RNA founders wanted to pursue through their independence movement. And, as you can guess, such books more than likely highlighted the whole list of Black heroes, including Harriet Tubman, Denmark Vesey, and others who fought against enslavement and sometimes died for their people. In doing so, New African parents wanted to help transform a quote unquote tragic history that Black children were and still are taught to be ashamed of into a history of liberation struggle that focused on Black self-activity in the face of dehumanizing conditions perpetuated and systematized by an oppressive people. And there's more, right? If we really look at this picture, we see that Noni has natural hair, and this is in the 1980s, after it had begun to go out of style. The point here is that self-worth was more achievable when one embraced one's natural self than when somebody pursued it through hot combs, chemical straighteners, curls, and other denaturalizing agents. And we can see that also reflected in Noni's clothing here. Even though we can't see the entire outfit, I did show a picture earlier that hopefully it reminds you of, and that's some of the original provisional government folks. I want to draw your attention specifically to Joan Franklin. And even though I'm not trying to say that this artist modeled this picture on Joan Franklin, I do think that generally speaking, it was intentional that the artist reached out to New African elders and longtime activists to help demonstrate how they were trying to pass down the ideas that they put in motion onto the next generation. And so we can compare the message being sent with the early image of these RNA founders with what we see here on this picture. And all of these things bring us back to the point that educating Black children should conform to the ultimate goals of independence, reparations, and global revolution against oppression. In other words, freeing the land requires freeing the mind. And I think that this quote is really useful for really making that point. Here we see Baba Hannibal Tyrus Afrique writing, "We must seek to educate African children to their maximum potential in order to take their rightful place in the development of a Black nationhood that will provide freedom, justice, and independence for our race." He says further, "We must strive to achieve this objective through living a new value system embodied in the Nguzo Saba." Hopefully that sounds familiar. This January, we just came out of Kwanzaa, right? And the Nguzo Saba are actually 7 principles: Umoja, Kujichagulia, Ujima, Ujamaa, Nia, Kuumba, and Imani. And even though we now associate them with Kwanzaa, I've been told that at some African-centered schools during the 60s and 70s, and even into the 80s, people tried to